see here. So one of the criticisms here, I'm going to summarize the comment here, is that presuppositionalism doesn't work because you can replace Christianity. If I were to say the Christian worldview provides the only necessary condition for knowledge, logic, intelligible experience, you can replace Christianity with any other religion. So other religions can use transcendental arguments. To be perfectly honest, that's true. Other religions can use nothing prevents a person from using a transcendental argument. That's not. Yes, you can say. Let's use my argument I made before. If knowledge is possible, Islam is true. Knowledge is possible, therefore Islam is true. That's an entirely appropriate argument if someone wanted to argue transcendentally, but that's not a deficiency of the argument, right? The question is, can the worldview that is being placed in that placeholder actually pay the bills on the claim to being the necessary preconditions for knowledge? And of course, we would argue that they do not. Christianity can, and we're willing to explain why, and the other perspectives cannot. And hopefully they're willing to explain why, and hence you have the hopefully the respectful interaction of worldview comparison and argumentation. What do you think?
Yeah, and the number two, the twofold again, as you said, you critique their worldview and show there's a deficiency, and the problem with the one and the many is the end all. I mean, there's no other religion or worldview that espouses that, and but it's an indispensable aspect metaphysically, and only Christianity has that. So you can do a reductio in that way and refute it that way, but the second point, again, B, is since you're relying on every single fundamental point that Christianity supplies the transcendentals for, every single one of them, if you're doing that, you're automatically assuming it's true again, and there's only one truth. You can't have two truths. So that's the twofold answer is, of course, we do a reductio. We observe and analyze where they're coming from. But then once we illustrate and show that they're assuming every aspect of Christianity, transcendentally speaking, then therefore Christianity is true because it does supply every transcendental necessarily, not possibly or sufficiently, but necessarily. Why? Because truth is exclusively true. Necessary truths are exclusive. There can be laws of logic where there's a law of non-contradiction, and then there's another law that negates the law of non-contradiction, and both are true. It's like one or the other.
Well, can you unpack that though? Because that's a key point that I think a lot of people miss. Like when we say that the Christian worldview provides the transcendental necessary preconditions for intelligibility, knowledge, so on and so forth. Why is it the case that it is only the Christian worldview? Why is it not the case that the presuppositionalist is not required to inductively refute every other option out there?
Yeah, if you want to simplify it, you could generalize it or abstract it, if you will, and just replace what we're talking about with transcendentals and just say facts or truths, right? And any layman can say, we know all these facts. There are like an infinite amount of facts to the universe. There are X amount of planets. They're in this relation. You have hazel eyes or whatever. There are all these facts, and any average person will say, well, yeah. And then you ask, well, can there also be facts that contradict all those facts and both of them are true? And again, any ordinary person would say no. And so then you can draw the conclusion to them and say, oh, okay, so obviously there are facts and they are exclusive facts. They can't contradict, right? They are the facts, the definite article. They are not a fact or facts in the indefinite article. So if you just generalize it to the level of facts that everyone has concepts of, I mean, even a layman can grasp, yeah, there are the facts, they can't contradict. And so obviously transcendentals are facts, and so they are the facts. And if they check off on the list every necessary precondition, not sufficient, but necessary, which is exclusive, then therefore it is necessarily true and therefore exclusively true. The facts are the facts. They can't be the facts and then contradictory facts at the same time. The facts are what they are, and so therefore they are the truth. And so the facts of Christianity having to be relied on and assumed draw the conclusion that the facts of Christianity are the truth, and so Christianity is the truth. Wow, John 14:6. Wow, who would have thought?
There's a consistency there. Why do presuppositionalists assume that they know other people's minds better than they do, and accuse unbelievers of lying about their beliefs? I would assume that this question is flowing from the idea that the Christian asserts, because the Bible teaches it, that unbelievers have a knowledge of God. I suppose that answers the question. If Christianity is true, I'm a Christian and I believe Christianity is true, and God exists and the Bible is his revelation, I guess to answer that question is, um, if if God exists, who knows the unbeliever better, God or the unbeliever? I mean, when you put it that way, it's pretty easy to answer. Obviously, God knows the unbeliever better than the unbeliever knows himself. And if the Bible is his word and he's revealed to us the nature of the unbeliever, then within the Christian worldview, it's entirely appropriate for us to say that to a certain degree, yes, there are certain things that I could know about the unbeliever because an all-knowing God who created all people revealed it. How would you speak to that?
Yeah, the theological aspects, that is correct. We don't know them better than they know themselves, but we know the one who does know them better than themselves, and he has revealed that information to us. So, from an ontological, theological perspective, yes, we do know more about you than you do, because you're trying to figure it out autonomously, and you'll never get there because you're subjective and fallible and limited. But from a philosophical perspective, unfortunately, we do know more about what is in their head than what they know about what's in their head because they're just simply not taught it. And namely, that's what I was talking about earlier, which is the issue of neutrality and worldviews. They don't think that way. The average person thinks objectively and they go to the facts. And they internally are not realizing that they're biased and they have their own worldview, which is why we have to keep belaboring that point to them. So it is an unfortunate truth that, yeah, we do know what's going on in your head more than you do if you don't know this issue of neutrality, bias, and worldviews and revisionary immunity for those who know. So, yes, theologically, we know them more than they do because God has revealed it. Philosophically, unless they are already acquainted with neutrality and worldviews, we know them better than they do, what's going on in their head, at least in that moment of discourse. So that's one of the problems you could say with presuppositionalism is Bonson and Van Til have pointed out these philosophical issues that that opponents have, these neutralities impossible, and they see things through a certain biased lens, but that people don't think about. Hence your classical, historic, traditional apologetic methods, right? They assume objectivity with regard to evidence and analysis. So, yeah, we do know them, unfortunately, better than they know themselves philosophically, what's going on in their head. So you have to kind of, baby them along, but not in a patronizing way or demeaning way, obviously, but, carrying them along and showing them these issues so that it gets to the point where we know each other at the same level and they understand, we understand, because it's only at that point that that conversation can flourish. If they're consistently not understanding, we have to keep making up for it. And that's exactly what happened in the Stein debate. And so Dr. Bonson knew what was happening in Stein's head more than he did. And so that's the point is, yes, we do know what's going on most of the time in their heads because they don't think about neutrality and worldviews and bias. But again, that's not a demeaning observation. We need to be charitable, and so forth. There's nothing wrong with being ignorant in certain respects or in any respect, so long as you're willing to accept education and information.
And I don't think this is a big deal either. If I were an atheist or a skeptic, and I acknowledged the issue of worldviews. Yeah, we all have presuppositions. Yeah, we're not neutral. I mean, I have my assumptions as well, and the other person has theirs. I don't. I mean, it's difficult for me to see how some people have difficulty understanding this. If I were a skeptic, it's entirely reasonable to think that if my Christian friend's perspective is true, then yeah, he would know certain things about me, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
if your worldview is true and there's a God and he's told you stuff about me, then yeah, you'd be in a position to know that. I don't believe that's true, but I understand why you believe that. I mean, I don't see why that's a difficult point to keep in mind. It's not insulting to say that
Right.
we know your mind in a certain regard. Obviously, we can't read your mind. We know things about you only in as much as God has revealed about you and about myself and about the nature of humanity and things like that. So
Yeah.
someone says here, how is saying the Bible is true because it's impossible for it to be otherwise different from asserting something like the moon is made of green cheese because it's impossible for it to be otherwise? Isn't this just a circular repetition? How would you respond to that?
No, because one of them is necessary and the other one's contingent. And what that means is if a fact is contingent, like the moon is made out of cheese, which it's not obviously, or if it's whatever it's made out of, or any fact in the universe, a fact being contingent means it doesn't have to necessarily be true. Like I exist, but that's a contingent fact, meaning I don't have to necessarily exist. I could have never been conceived or anything like that. But God's existence, again, standing on the Christian worldview for the sake of the argument, it is necessary. He cannot not exist. And so is his word by extension. He's given it to us. So now it can no longer not exist and it's infallible. So the two are on, again, different planes, like creator-creature distinction. Certain facts are contingent. They don't have to be true. I don't have to exist. You don't have to exist. And other facts aren't necessarily true, like the laws of logic. Facts cannot contradict each other. 2 + 2 = 4. God must exist. So you have to take into account that dichotomy that facts are not just facts. You have different kinds of facts, facts which are necessary and facts which aren't. And so different planes, therefore it's not special pleading. And so that's how it's different with saying the moon is made out of cheese and God exists necessarily. On a Christian worldview, or even on the atheistic worldview, they know certain facts are necessary and other facts aren't. And so you have to just take into account that dichotomy. They're not on the same plane. So therefore, you can't use the same analysis to analyze both of them and bring them on the same standards because they have different standards.
Right. I think the questioner is failing to recognize that on the one hand, you're just dealing with what the moon is made out of, and on the other hand, you're dealing with what's the necessary preconditions for any knowledge whatsoever. And again, it's just a failure to understand that distinction.
It's also the fact that those contingent facts are local, and that's an important word to remember. They're local, and so therefore they're not necessary. It's not detrimental if they're not true. Well, in principle, it would be very detrimental if the sun did not exist. It's a local consideration, and it doesn't have to. It's contingent. But yeah, so there's local, and then there's universal. Like contradictions can't be true in another part of the universe, or God cannot exist in certain places, or whatever. So you have local, and then universal.
Next comment here. How can a book be an authority on something? Isn't authoritativeness a quality that, or he says, books, or what does he say? He says, how can a book be an authority on something? Isn't authoritativeness a quality that books simply don't have? How would you
No,
interact with it?
no. The authority, by definition, is not predicated upon inanimate objects like pages and ink and stuff. Authority comes from a sentient being, a conscious being. And so what is in the book, the content, comes from an authority. It relays the information from an authority. I mean, it's absurd, and I don't mean that in a personal way with the questioner, to think that a book in itself has authority, or a plant or a frog or whatever. The book is a relaying of the authority of what it says. So I open a book in a science class in college or whatever, and I'm reading it, and the information itself is not an authority, but it came from another authority, which were the authors and professors who wrote the book. So books in themselves don't have authority. Our authority for the Bible, its authority comes from God, His word.
And I think this person is also failing to make a distinction between linguistic tokens and their reference.
Yeah, exactly. It's the reference of the linguistics in the book that
Right.
is the authority, not the linguistics themselves.
Right. So the words that we're using refer to certain things, or they're being communicated by someone who has authority. And in that sense, the Bible is authoritative, not in and of itself, but in light of the fact that the words and the language, the linguistic tokens, capture the essence and meaning and content of the divine mind from within the Christian worldview. Someone says here, how is your argument different from the explanation of lightning as Thor's hammer? If someone doesn't have a better explanation for lightning, does that prove it's Thor's hammer? I mean, stuff like this it can be a little frustrating. I mean, no one's arguing the God of the gaps. Like a transcendental argument isn't a God of the gaps argument. I mean, this is a popular thing for skeptics to say, like, it's like, well, the lightning and no one could explain. It's like, well, no one's arguing that. It's not even the nature of the argument. What can you unpack that? What can you explain to the audience? What is a God of the gaps argument, and why isn't the transcendental argument a God of the gaps argument?
Yeah, God of the gaps fills in God, as the title implies, into areas in which we are ignorant, in hopes that that's true, and obviously because it makes sense from the paradigms in which you personally reason. So we fill in God in certain respects that we can't explain, at least sufficiently. And so the reason presuppositionalism is not God of the gaps centers around the fact that our epistemology is revelational. And so in layman's terms, that means our theory of knowledge, what we know, of how we know things, what is knowledge, how do we define that, where does it come from? That theory that we hold to as Christians comes from the Bible, which is from God. And we have it tangibly, and we read it, we have the information from our God, our maker. And so therefore, we begin with the authority of the book. Van Til says verbatim, again, I don't remember which work, we begin on scriptural authority. And so therefore, we don't begin with, oh, there might be certain gaps here or there. No, we begin with an exhaustive system that God has revealed in so much as he has revealed the information. Obviously, it's limited, but it is enough information by which we can justify and prove Christianity as being necessarily true. And so we don't fill in God anywhere. We begin not with partial ignorance, we begin with zero ignorance. We begin with all the information. We start on its authority, and then if you want to debate that, you can come to our worldview on its infallibility and so forth. And the other reason it differs is because you want to argue with Thor's hammer and lightning. It's like, well, if you that belief is baseless, first of all, and conversely, our beliefs are not baseless because we have the Bible. So that's where it's also different. You can't just give a claim, oh, it could be Thor's lightning. Yeah, could be. But our argument is not could be. Our argument is dogmatic. It is this way, which is why it's very important for presuppositionalists to be humble, have humility, and follow 1 Peter 3:15.
Thank you for that. Someone says here, could it be that we may not, no, did we do that one here? Okay, so could it be that we may not yet know the true explanation for the necessary transcendental preconditions for intelligible experience? Yes or no? If your answer is no, then you don't need to do more than claim Yahweh is the explanation. Don't you have to actually demonstrate that only Yahweh can be the explanation? Does this make sense? That's the person's question.
Yeah, I've already done that too with and number two, twofold. Number one is, again, truth can't be contradictory. We have the truth, it is the truth, it is the definite article, the, not a. And B, we have that information, again, obviously. And so the way we prove it beyond a conceptual aspect, again, the armchair sort of thing, we prove it externally and verify it, and therefore refute the proposition that there could be, is the demonstration of, I laid out my worldview with consciousness and knowledge. But wait a minute, you're conscious and you have knowledge, you're assuming my position. And so when you even offer the proposition, could there not be another one? You're assuming the truth of my position, again, the truth, simultaneously, and offering a skeptical proposition.
All right, thank you for that. Here's a fun one. If you don't have a response to these objections, I guess the person had a list of, why do you keep this channel alive? Again, I'm not obligated to respond to everyone's objections. We're trying to respond to some of them here. So yeah, there's good reason to keep the channel alive. I just don't feel obligated to respond to literally every single comment that pops up on the comment section. With respect to Dr. Richard Howe, who has now become an acquaintance of mine and a good friend, I actually have his personal number here, so he's encouraged me to reach out and get connected. I was able to meet him at Southern Evangelical Seminary. There was an event that they held out in, was it South Carolina? I think it was somewhere in South Carolina. I was able to meet with him. We went out to lunch. Excellent guy, great brother. Person says here, is it possible that Dr. Richard Howe, who's a known let me say, he's a classical apologist, and so he's a known critic of presuppositionalism. Is it possible that Dr. Richard Howe understands presuppositionalism but rejects it anyway? And
No.
the well, I suppose someone could understand a view correctly, but then just not agree with it. I suppose that's possible. But I've interacted with Dr. Howe's objections, especially some of the objections that he brought up in his interview with Cameron Bertuzzi all those years ago on Capturing Christianity. And these objections, I think, are easily answerable. And I say that respectfully because after talking to Dr. Howe, he's a brilliant guy. He's super intelligent, and I greatly respect him as a Christian brother. But no, his objections I don't think are good at all. They're not at all challenging, especially his assertion that, why can't other religions use the transcendental argument? I think he said something along those lines, and I mean that's been responded to a million times. That's not a difficult question to answer at all. So yeah, I think he could understand it. I don't think he does as well as he probably thinks. I say that respectfully. But I think it's possible for someone to understand a view and say, yeah, I understand it, but I reject it for these reasons.
I mean, I said no, and I only said that because he's misconstrued some of it or he's ignorant. And I wrote a paper in response almost immediately after that interview with Cameron about his misrepresentations. I think it's on Apologetics Central. Arne
Arne
Vester, is that
Verster or something like that. Yeah.
It's on his responding to the criticisms of Richard Howe, and they were mainstream. He does know it. He's not completely ignorant, but he's at least a very respectable critic. He's very smart. So is what's his name? Keith Morrison or
Matheson.
Matheson. Yeah, going over Van Til. I mean, they're knowledgeable. They're just mistaken, and so they're certainly better than a mainstream critic who just
Yes.
circularity and you don't use evidence and
Right.
stuff
The
like
Bible's true because the Bible's true, that kind of stuff.
yeah. So no,
Yeah.
they're respectable. I would like to engage with them, at some point in my
Hmm.
life, but
Sure.
yeah. So
All right. Someone says, can epistemology be independent of metaphysics? Isn't it true that you can't ask an ontological question and expect an epistemological answer and vice versa? That's the question. What do you say to that?
no, I mean your epistemology and metaphysics are intertwined. So if for instance you're a materialist, or if you say we know things through our senses, that at the same time assumes a metaphysical reliability of you as a conscious creature. You're assuming you're conscious, we can know things, you have reliable senses, and so forth. And so you cannot divorce that. It's actually called Methodism. It sounds like the church, but it's been philosophically known as Methodism, where let's start with epistemology first and go to metaphysics. But you cannot divorce the two, because as soon as you answer or ask the question, what do we know? You're simultaneously having to ask, how do we know what we know? So if we know that the world is material, you're already assuming, how do we know what we know, as your senses, your reliable senses. If you assume the world is immaterial, if you're an idealist, metaphysically speaking, your epistemology is not going to be empirical, like we go out and observe, like Hume or Locke or whatever, but it's going to be rational. You're going to think intuitively. So Plato, was on the immaterialistic side. He didn't go out and observe the forms he argued for. That was his metaphysical view, but his epistemology conformed to that as a rationalist. And Aristotle's epistemology was let's go out and see, but his metaphysics was different, and that the universals were in the particulars and so forth. So no, you cannot divorce epistemology, because as soon as you make an epistemological inquiry, you're already assuming certain metaphysical presuppositions about that epistemology. You can't ask what do we know without simultaneously asking how do we know what we know. What do we know about evolution, but how do we know what we know at all to begin with? So you can't endorse Methodism. You can't separate epistemology from metaphysics.
Okay, very good. Let's see. There's a lot of kind of repeat kind of questions. One here, someone says, doesn't presuppositional apologetics have nothing specifically to do with Christianity? Couldn't you just replace the adjective Christian with Muslim? We already addressed that here. All right, this is an interesting one. Someone said in one of the comments, there are no presuppositions. All right, logic exists, reality, memory, etc. We know these things all follow absolutely from the fact that I exist and I can think. So this person says they have no presuppositions.
Yeah,
Oh,
this goes back to where the question of, do presuppositionalists think they know their opponent more than they do?
mhm.
And this again is a yes answer. We do, because they're not understanding what a presuppositional is. It's a foundational assumption. So when they talk about, we know logic exists, we know we exist. I mean, those are foundational assumptions. You can't just say logic exists and not assume it exists. That doesn't make any sense. So presuppositions are foundational assumptions. Everyone has assumptions, and that they hold to. And so that questioner just doesn't understand that everyone has assumptions, and it's just utter nonsense to say we don't have assumptions, but we can argue and live our lives. Like, no, we have foundational assumptions about the nature of reality, the nature of who you are, man, and the nature of morality.
Hmm. All right. How can you know that God is not a trickster God or just your imagination instead of the Christian God? So in other words, if we're arguing that God is the foundation for truth and knowledge, how do you know God is not a deceiving God? We're not being deceived. So we have the old deceiving God objection. I mean,
Descartes.
I suppose that would be an external critique, right? I mean, as a presupposition, and I would argue as a necessary presupposition or a precondition for knowledge, is that God is truth telling always. Within the Christian worldview, the Bible says it is impossible for God to lie. How do we know this? God has revealed it. How do we know this and justify it? By the impossibility of the contrary. Assume a lying God, and you lack the foundation for knowledge. So when someone says, how do you know it's not a trickster God? At that point, when we entertain the possibility of God being a trickster, we are no longer talking about the Christian worldview, because now we are talking about God, the idea of God, independent of the Christian context in which we find it. So how would you expand on that, or expound on that, or explain that from your perspective, Josh?
I'm going to invoke the number two again. I got 2 points for that.
Okay.
The first is, again, you have to stand on the Christian position. God is not a deceiver. And you might know, I could be completely wrong. I think it's in First Kings where God sends a deceiving spirit, but it was to those who were not his children, obviously, those who are lost and wicked. There's none who does good. But he himself cannot lie. I think it's Malachi 3:5 or it's 3:6. And so he can't lie. So on the Christian position, again, you have to accept it on its own authority to critique it internally, or you can maintain that my God is a trickster and critique it externally, and therefore commit the fallacy of the straw man. And so those are the two answers. You have to stand on my position for the sake of the argument. Oh my goodness, look what he says. He cannot lie. He's infallible. His word's infallible. And second, if you want to reject the infallibility of the Bible and not stand on my worldview, then make my day and commit a straw man fallacy. Uh, Actually, the main second point is, if let's assume you're right, and let's do a reductio. Okay, my God could be a trickster. Well, if my God is a trickster, there therefore then is real definitively no basis for knowledge or uniformity of nature, how we can know anything. There's no basis for anything we can claim or argue for. And so if I assume that the skeptic is right, that my God could be a trickster, he has no foundation by which he can even ask that question to begin with. It's self-stultifying, it's self-defeating, because he has no foundation or rationality by which he could even be rational to begin with. In which case, there's no meaning behind his proposition, his claim, in which case I can just ignore it. If you're not going to stand on my position, we're done arguing. If you want to propose that my God is a trickster, you have no basis or rationality or foundation for even making the claim, because you can't even explain the knowledge you possess by which you can even argue at all, or cogitate at all. So either way, you lose.
Thank you for that. I hear this one a lot. This is odd. I mean, people don't understand what apologetics is. The person said, isn't it hilarious that Christianity needs apologetics? If Christianity were true, then why would apologetics exist? Isn't apologetics just justifying your position of dishonesty? Well, to answer the last part, no, it's not. Here's a question. Is it only Christians that engage in apologetics?
It's like you could literally be anyone and give an apologetic for anything. Now, apologia is the Greek, and apologetic means to give a defense of a certain viewpoint.
Right.
Politics, religion. I mean, you could even do something menial like, is it going to rain in the next 30 minutes? And your buddy's next to you and he says, I don't think it will. And you say, no, look at the wind, the clouds are cumulonimbus or whatever the clouds are. And so technically you are giving a defense of your position and apologetic that way, though that's not really the way it's used. But no, an apologia is Greek for giving a defense, in a court of law primarily is what it was used for. So no, anyone can use an apologetic, any religious person, but also any non-religious person. That's an apologetics, just defending your position or vindicating yourself.
Right. I don't see any connection with Christianity being true and also needing to defend it. Obviously, we have to defend things that are true all the time, because there are things that are true that people don't believe. And so we defend positions that we believe to be true. I don't see why this is a difficult concept. So I've actually seen that pop up multiple times, like on Twitter and YouTube comments. I mean, I don't get it. I don't get the
and it's like, God doesn't need to defend himself, but he has ordained that his creatures do defend him in the truth of Christianity, as a means of glorifying him, even though he himself doesn't need to defend himself in a sense. So, it kind of is tethered to, why does God need you to defend him if he's God? Well, those are the means by which he's ordained it. Is that a conflict? Well, no. It's just a means by which he's done it.
Right. Isn't presuppositional apologetics a joke to non-Christians, pure entertainment? Do non-Christians see it as you? Non-Christians see it as you abandoning reason and evidence for an argument no better than nuh-uh. So again, this I don't know where this idea comes from, that presuppositionalism entails an abandoning of reason and evidence. We affirm the use of reason. We affirm the use of evidence. but we don't affirm them in an autonomous and neutral fashion. So I suppose this person seems to be exposing their non-neutral stance that reason and evidence is only worth something when it is predicated upon the assumed neutrality and autonomy of the unbeliever, which of course is question begging. Am I right? Am I off here?
Yeah, assuming in advance certain beliefs, which again everyone does, it's not fallacious. And again, I want to belabor this point before I answer the question. I'll do it
Mm-hmm.
really quick. When presuppositionalists rightfully point out that everyone takes for granted certain assumptions, the key word there is assumptions. Think about that. Begging the question refers to a circular argument. It doesn't refer to assumptions. And any primer logic course on like day one will tell you there's a difference between an argument and an assumption, the two A's. With exceptions, fallacies do not pertain to cognitive assumptions internal as opposed to arguments that are given. You have certain, ad hominems or fallacies where you're wearing a stupid tie, so let's not listen to you, or reification fallacies. Yeah, those apply to assumptions, but most fallacies don't apply to assumptions. And so when I am taking for granted certain assumptions, that's not a fallacy, especially because you're doing the same thing. And with regard to, well, isn't it just a nuh-uh sort of argument? 2 points. That's the power of transcendental reasoning. Is we're not going to let you get away with trying to justify rationality when you have no basis for it. We're going to point it out every time. We're going to call you out every time. And so that's where they get the notion that we just say nah to everything. But the difference is it's not just an irrational close your ears and just say nah, I'm right, you're wrong. It's just shutting them down at every point with transcendental analysis and saying nah, you're not that's not an explanation here. Nah, yeah, that's not an explanation there, until you eventually just completely crumble their worldview. So yeah, you could say it's a nah, but it has kind of a negative, immature connotation to it.
Well,
But
I don't think we're giving a mere nuh-uh. I mean, the
yeah.
nuh-uh is followed with a transcendental analysis and an explanation as to why the attempted justification that was provided doesn't work, right? So
Yeah,
we're
it's
not
not
just
even
right.
the entire difference. That makes an entire difference between an irrational nuh-uh and a rational nuh-uh. The rational nuh-uh is going through arguments and analysis consistently and charitably and non-fallaciously, of course. And that's what we're doing in terms of we're shutting you down when you're trying to justify these preconditions, but it doesn't work. So we're just going to say nuh-uh. And that's why I said presuppositionalism is dogmatic. And Bonson pointed that out again. That's why you need to be humble. But it's not an irrational nuh-uh. It's a rational nuh-uh. This sounds weird, just keep saying that over and over again. In terms of argumentation and analysis, discursive reasoning with your opponent. And so, no, it's not just an irrational shutting down. And we shouldn't just say nuh-uh all the time, obviously, but no. So it's not closing your ears and just saying you're wrong. There is analysis. And again, that's presuppositionalism. Certain presuppositionalists will not exactly hit the point and then therefore may sound like they're doing this not sort of thing. But again, that's the spokesman, the ist for the ism. And the ism, the method is not closing your ears and saying it's shutting them down at every point transcendentally just through rational argumentation and analysis.
Right. Okay. Good. Now this next comment is in the context of induction and the uniformity of nature. And so one skeptic said, I don't need to presuppose your God to justify the uniformity of nature. The person said this, okay, so far, nature has been uniform. If it started to be ununiform, that would be observed and taken into account. Okay, so this person says, that's it. I've justified it. I don't need that. So how would you respond to that? And is this something new? Is this something that, presuppositionalists never heard of, right? Like, oh man, I guess you've provided a justification for the uniformity of nature and induction and all this stuff.
Yeah, well, 2 points again. Number one is it's arbitrary to say it just is that way. There's no justification for it.
Oh,
And so,
wait. I have to interrupt you. Are
uh-oh.
you pointing that out as a presuppositionalist, or have other skeptical philosophers pointed that very point out?
Yeah, I should have said on your worldview. On your worldview, there's no justification. There never will be either. Either for its uniformity, why it's law-like, and into the future as well. There's no guarantee for anything. You could come up with probabilities, but those don't work because probabilities assume the uniformity of nature, but that's the very thing in question. So any argument you give begs the question. There's just such an undermining albatross to that position. And so, secondly, the Christian answer is we don't have an arbitrary answer because we have an explanation for it, which is, of course, we talked about God upholding and so forth. So, no, you can't just say it just is that way and we're very happy. Well, you can, but it's not an argument. It's not rational because there's no justification. In which case, I can say, hey, Mr. Atheist, God exists and it just is that way. You have to accept it. Well, he's not going to accept that for a minute. So I'm not going to accept for a minute your claim that it just is that way because it's not rational and you're not giving a justification for it. You're left in arbitrariness and irrationality and skepticism. So, yeah, yeah, it's that way. Well, of course it's that way. But you need to give an answer as to why. And if you don't have an answer as to why, then you can't account for knowledge or anything you have intelligibility on your worldview. That alone undermines it.
But Joshua, it is that way because it's always been that way in the past, right? All of our experience, right? And again, what I've asked before, it really, this isn't something that presuppositionalists point. I mean, this was pointed out by David Hume. I mean, the problem of induction, this isn't like a weird thing like presuppositionalists made up and is like, well, how do you know the sun's going to rise tomorrow? As though like this is just something we're just pulling out of a hat, right? I mean, David Hume brought this very point up, right? When we say, how do you know that the future will be like the past? Not a good answer would be this. This is not a good answer because it's always been that way in the past. Well, that's not the question being asked you. The question is, how do you know it's going to be that way in the future? You cannot move from past experiences of regularity and project that into the future without assuming or presupposing, in a non-empirical fashion, mind you, the uniformity of nature. On what basis do you assume uniformity such that you can be rationally justified to projecting that into the future, that it will very likely be the case that the future will be like the past? Okay, this isn't a presuppositional critique made by like Bonton and Van Til originally. This was brought up by folks like David Hume and others. So this is a perfectly valid point to bring up. And just saying it's been that way, and when it changes, then we'll worry about it, is not really a rational answer. It is arbitrary.
Yeah, and it goes back thousands of years. It doesn't stop
Yep.
with David Hume in the 1700s. So and it's important to know that when I step on the unbelieving worldview, basically I'm no longer a Christian. I'm just like you. Hey, we're friends now. Now let's examine the facts on our worldview together and see where they lead. So I'm basically just turning into David Hume or any other skeptical philosopher who wasn't a Christian throughout history. That's all I am. I'm on your side, buddy. But now let's try and solve this together. I'm not a Christian. And then, of course, they won't have an answer, and then I'll become a Christian again. And I like using that terminology because it's different, so to speak. It gets the point across. And now let's examine it on my worldview.
You're just doing internal critique. That's basically what you're doing.
That's all I'm doing, yeah. And I call what you're talking about the track record approach. Well, we have a good track record. It's always been uniform, so it should be uniform in the future. But of course, a track record doesn't automatically mean it'll happen in the future. There's a good student in school and they get all the A's, and then okay, well, they'll finish all A's, 4.0 GPA by the end of the school year. Well, maybe something will happen traumatic in their life, and all of a sudden they're just gone and they fail half their classes. Just because they had a track record of having all A's doesn't mean something's going to happen and everything's going to go haywire, and then they fail half their classes at the end of the school year. So that track record approach is illegitimate, it's insufficient, and it begs the question, because the very thing in question is whether or not it'll be uniform into the future, not the past. Congratulations. Thank God it's been in the past, but we don't know the future. The track record could always break in an instant. That student could snap, or the laws of physics could change on a dime, and then now we don't exist anymore.
Unless you insert a presupposition that nature is uniform.
And the question is, therefore, can that presupposition be justified? Which, again, we have to lay it out. On our definition, we can justify it transcendentally. We're not following the dictionary definition.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Very good. Let's see here. This person's trying to account for logic without God. They say, isn't it true that you can't have a married bachelor because of the definitions of the word married and bachelor? And this truth exists whether God exists or not. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, and this goes back again to how we know our opponent more than he does. That is necessarily and definitionally true. That cannot be that way because it's a contradiction in terms. Wait a minute, contradiction? Oh, that's the second law of logic. Wait a minute, we're trying to figure out how we justify the laws of logic. Wait a minute, it doesn't happen on your worldview, but on my worldview it does. Wait a minute, that must mean God exists in order to account for, bachelors have to be unmarried males. So wait a minute, that means Christianity is true because you're relying on it being true. And so it's just this, series of progressions where no, logic doesn't exist in a vacuum. And that question was asked in the Stein debate, and Bonson addressed that as well. That'll be in the forthcoming book. How logic has a transcendental aspect to it where it must necessarily exist. No one's denying that unless you're an absurd skeptic. So I agree with you, Mr. Atheist, that you can't have bachelors being married males. The question is, what's the foundation underneath it by which, we can explain logic to begin with? Because
But
you can't
what?
just have
But I've heard skeptics say, "But why do I need a foundation?" Like you're saying, I need this foundation for logic. Why do I need it? It's like it's just a presupposition. I start with it. Like I don't need a foundation for this. Why do I need a foundation for logic?
well, two answers. Again, logic.
I
Hey,
don't know.
man, I mean, it's just more material for the viewers. It's more beneficial. Or the first answer is logic. If you can't just presuppose logic because laws of logic in and of themselves don't justify intelligible experience, why you exist, why nature is uniform. It's just isolated. And so Van Til would say it's just like one rock falling in a bottomless ocean. And I like how he called it a rock because rocks are solid. And so you have a very solid argument here where laws of logic are necessary, they're transcendental. But if they're isolated, that doesn't explain anything. It doesn't come close to explaining intelligibility. You need a holistic system that explains everything, not just one thing like logic. And so the second point, therefore, is even if he could justify logic transcendentally on his worldview, laws of logic, mathematics, it's arbitrary or insufficient, rather, because he can't explain the whole system, but he doesn't have the whole enchilada. He has a slice of it, as Bonson would say. And so if he does it in an isolation fashion, it's insufficient. You're still in absurdity. And if you can't do it holistically and just says it is that way holistically, that also ends up absurdity because that's not a justification. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place.
All right, our last question here, and I've heard
Wait,
this
are you
question.
serious? We got through all of them?
Yeah, we got through most of them, and some of them are kind of repeated a little bit in like a different form. And then there's one last question that I'm actually going to save for another episode because I'm going to have a guest to talk about Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem and how that relates to transcendental argumentation and worldview analysis. That might be interesting for folks who watched my video on math.
I've studied that too. I mean, it's very compelling, Kurt Gödel, and his theorems and so forth. That, and I think I've written a short paper on that as well. That'll be interesting to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be good. So questions like that, I think, are good questions. It's like, hey, let's talk about Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem and how that relates to worldview and stuff like that. See, that's a well thought out question, and whoever asked it, I appreciate it. But the Bible's true because the Bible's true. That's like, okay. Like, yeah, all right. So here's the last question. Why can't you give one shred of credible evidence for your God? Now, that's a very basic question, and the person can't get past this. I mean, I don't know how else to help them. But when you ask for quote unquote credible evidence, I mean, you don't see how credibility is worldview dependent. I mean, obviously, what you think is credible is going to be based upon your presuppositions. And so I can give you evidence for God, but we need to address the presuppositional issue. And we have done so when we present the transcendental argument. By the way, you can give philosophical evidence for something. You can give empirical evidence for something, right? There are different ways you can present the evidence. But to ask the question, give me credible evidence, we have to establish what is the standard of credibility, because obviously we're coming from completely different worldview perspectives. So how would you speak? How would you speak to that?
Yeah, it really, what people need to understand is that there's no one type of proof or evidence or one type of evidence if you want to use them synonymously. You have rational type proofs, rationalists, which were in Europe, continental Europe, where they tried to come up with evidence in their head. You have empirical type proofs, which were the British empiricists, and they try to come up with evidence and rationality for the universe empirically with their senses. You have pragmatic evidence where if something works, then it's obviously true. And then you have transcendental evidence, which shows something to be true because you're assuming it to be true implicitly. You can't escape it. It's necessarily true. And that's the problem with that person. And many, many people say the same thing, is they don't understand transcendental proof. American people are the same as British mostly, and that we subscribe to that empirical approach, science. That's always been embedded in the UK and American, historically speaking. And then Americans came up with pragmatism as well, kind of as an offshoot to empirical proofs. So you have to understand there are different types of proofs. This is a 2 point thing again. And so the problem is, since we are so acquainted with seeing is believing empirical proofs, Americans are not uh, inclined or have an aptitude to understand transcendental proofs. So you have to kind of ingrain that type of proof, which is why he says no shred of credible evidence. Well, the type of evidence I'm giving is different. We're not doing science, all right? So broaden your mind. There are different types of evidences and proofs. So then the second point would therefore also be, apart from that ignorance of having four types of proofs and not just, oh, there's proof or not proof, is again that worldview consideration that you mentioned. They come to the table with certain assumptions and biases. And so they may even say, yeah, there are four types of proof, but then they could say, I reject this transcendental proof. The only legitimate proof is empirical. But that comes from their worldview. So you go on their worldview and critique it again. So those are the two answers. You have to understand there are different types of proofs, and you have to kind of baby American learners, online or in person, about the transcendental type proof. I've done this with my pastor, and I'm slowly getting him to get to presuppositionalism, because I think Lutherans could be the only other denomination, despite kind of being insufficient. They could be, even though Van Til criticizes them, the only other denomination that can do presuppositionalism. So I'm slowly getting him there, and he's struggling with transcendental type proofs as well. So I'm experiencing this. And so you have to baby them. You have to explain to people like that guy who commented there are different types of evidences, and then you have to critique his position from where he's coming from to show it's just absurd and it's insufficient.
Right. And what we're not saying in that process is that when we do critique an opponent's position, we're not saying my position is true simply because I've refuted your position.
Right.
That's another thing. That's not what we're arguing. That's not entailed by presuppositionalism. I'm sorry if that's what a presuppositionalist gave to you. They're like, I disproved you, therefore my position is true. That's not what the presuppositional approach is. As we spoke about earlier, there is definitely a two-step aspect to it in which we give the positive presentation as to why, given the Christian metaphysical picture, the Christian epistemological picture, the Christian ethical picture, that our worldview actually has what is needed to satisfy those preconditions for knowledgeable and knowledge and intelligible experience.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that
If you
is,
don't,
yep,
if you don't mind, if I could give just like a short illustration
sure.
of how transcendental proofs work from a local perspective, because tag is it's the broadest way you could argue, and so it kind of, you get overwhelmed. Opponents get overwhelmed.
Mhm.
So I like just giving them a local illustration, and most of the time they get it. And so I usually say, okay, imagine a deranged skeptic comes up to you and says, "I don't exist," and you look at him like, "What's this dude's IQ?" Right? And you're like, well, what kind of statement is that? And when you point out to them, well, sir, you're assuming your existence and even trying to postulate that you don't exist. You have to exist in order to say you don't exist. And so that's a transcendental type of proof. You're assuming the very thing you're denying. You're assuming your existence and saying you don't exist. And you do the same with language. Hey, you just use the language to tell me you don't exist, or to tell me language doesn't exist, but you're relying on it being true that language exists. So those are like local illustrations of saying you have to rely on certain things as being true in order to refute them. You're assuming them as true. So you could say transcendental proof is an ironic proof, because you're assuming that thing you're denying. The thing. So I like giving those local illustrations, and hopefully it gets in their heads. You start with that baby step, and then once they get it, then naturally speaking, it slowly broadens, and then they start to understand the broad context of tag of
Mm.
transcendental application. So I hope that helps people watching.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to bring up something that you made mention of. Maybe people have it kind of caught their attention. You said something about the nature of presuppositions and whether they can be justified. And so we argue that presuppositions can be justified transcendentally. And that some people see presuppositions as like axioms. And you said something about using different definitions. Like we're not using the dictionary definition. Some people might think that's kind of like a fallacy. You're using kind of a word in a very idiosyncratic way. That's not how I typically present it. But I mean, obviously, you're your own person. You have your own views and stuff. Can you unpack what you mean by that? Are we using some idiosyncratic definition of a word that it doesn't mean that in any other context except in this weird presuppositional voodoo sense? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, well, who or what defines words? And obviously, it's society at large. Okay. Why should not a smaller society like presuppositionalists be able to alter, or not even alter, incorporate a new definition? Who or what says, no, 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 that's fallacious on his worldview? And he has no basis for it. It might seem like that's arbitrary, you're not allowed to do that, but he can't justify that assumption apart from personal prejudice. So there's nothing saying you can't alter or incorporate a different definition, especially because it doesn't in any way remove the definition in the dictionary. We're not doing anything with that. We still can accept it if my opponent wants to use that definition. We use our opponent's definitions because that's part of an internal critique. That's part of their worldview, their position. So it's not. You could say it's collectively idiosyncratic in terms of the presuppositional camp, but he can't prove that it's fallacious, especially because we're not denying the mainstream definition. We're just using our own definition. And if he wants to use the dictionary definition, we'll use his definition. So there's nothing, he can't prove there's anything wrong with that. And there is nothing wrong with that. And if you want, we could, it's like coming up with a new word. Well, let's replace presupposition with foundation supposition or, whatever. And, oh, well, how do you define that? And then you give the definition. He wouldn't give a second thought to thinking, oh, that could be fallacious. He came up with a new word, a new definition. There's nothing fallacious about that. So why would it be fallacious to incorporate a new definition with a current word without altering the current definition? So,
Because I've always taken the presupposition, at least in these discussions, that there is a difference between an axiom and a fundamental presupposition. And to my understanding, axioms are, you know, you don't demonstrate axioms because it's axiomatic, right? You don't justify. But within like a kind of an ultimate presupposition, they can be justified via transcendental analysis. So I was wondering why you made that distinction in terms of how you understand that word. So that was just my
yeah,
thoughts there.
and it's the equivalent of like a foundationalist with properly basic beliefs, and they're
Yeah.
not justified, or they're not justified the same way as non-foundational beliefs. But if I subscribe to coherentism with the different structure of definition, they wouldn't for a minute say, "Oh, that's fallacious." Definitions for your foundational beliefs are different than mine. It doesn't really follow the dictionary. They wouldn't say that's fallacious. So who cares if I'm adding our own definition? It's irrelevant at the end of the day. All that's relevant is they're accepting our position and our beliefs on the term, and then going from there and trying to critique it and so
Critique
forth.
the idea. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that. Well, that was the last of the questions. And obviously, they're not all of the comments. I mean, there's so many, and we have already gone a long time. So please, if you're watching this and you're like, well, he didn't address my comment, it's like, I mean, I can address all of them. And it's actually quite difficult to try to scour through them because, I have to get through the regular comments and then the specific comment that seems interesting enough to kind of address. And then there are ones that people leave like a long, because I'm not going to be reading like a whole long thing here in this context, because we can probably take an entire episode just addressing one person's questions to everyone's satisfaction. So I hope this is somewhat helpful. If it's not, I mean, maybe in the future we'll try to collect more and we'll try to address more, but hope this was helpful for folks. I just want to bring everyone's attention to this book over here once more, The Objective Proof for Christianity. This is a transcription of sorts, a little bit edited for a book form, of Dr. Bonson's lecture series on transcendental arguments. And here, my guest, Joshua Pillows, participated in the editing process and even wrote the appendix to this book. Am I correct here?
Yeah, I wrote probably half the footnotes. The other half of the footnotes are Bonson and Butler's words, like the main book section, but they're more of like notes to what he was saying, and they were more fitting for a transcript, and they have their names in that footnote, knowing it they're saying it. But when they don't have their names, I've probably written half the footnotes and then the entire appendix, which is like 60 something pages. It's basically the
just so people
equivalent.
get an idea, visual. He wrote quite a bit there
Yeah,
of the appendix.
it's like a master's thesis, basically, and a very, very, very philosophical in terms of defending the transcendental argument for God's existence. So that's another 60 or 70 pages of my material. So I'm basically a co-author, if you want to combine the appendix and then half the footnotes I've written, elucidating the harder material. And then same thing with the new book, the Great Debate book coming out next month. My footnotes are in certain places. And then the appendix is mine and Bonson's because I quote him extensively in the appendix. So basically a co-author there. as well.
And if folks are interested in kind of dipping their feet in presuppositional apologetics, maybe you're listening to this and you're like, what the heck are they talking about? This is big words like transcendental, all that kind of stuff. How can I kind of just dip my toes in presuppositional apologetics and get a very practical, because practical presup is really going to depend on your context. I mean, YouTube is my context. I'm interacting with people who are a little bit more sophisticated than maybe the average person on the street. So I'm going to be speaking different language than, say, like the person in the pew. So if you're looking for something more basic but super helpful, a new edition of the book, Every Believer Confident, just came out by Mark Farnham. And I highly recommend. I wrote one of the endorsements on the back here, and I said, quoting myself, one of the best introductions to presuppositional apologetics available today, and I stand by that. This is a great introductory, like entry level book to get you into kind of a very basic but very good and helpful introduction to how to do presuppositional apologetics. So, Every Believer Confident by Mark Farnham. Had him on the show a while back. Folks might find that super helpful. Well, Josh, yep.
And one more thing I keep
Go for it.
I'm currently writing a book as well, or a short book. And I tentatively called it Presuppositionalism for Dummies because Bonson was a genius, but I've read that book, Every Believer Confident. I think it was an older edition. Great book, especially over the method and everything. But I'm writing a book like for dummies because at the end of Objective Proof for Christianity, Bonson said it would break his heart if that apologetic could not be utilized by an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old. Because you've read that book. That book is very philosophical. So he said, break my heart. So it should be utilized for kids as well, even though they don't necessarily need it as much as adults do. So I'm writing it for dummies. A whole methodological exposition and some answers to critics that the wording itself would be found in like a middle school book. It's not or philosophical. It sounds like maybe a teenager wrote it like on purpose. So hopefully that'll come out soon. I'm sure Gary, the American Vision, will publish that because Bonson's books are very heavy, even though they are methodical. But I really want something really succinct that gets the point across to where an 8-year-old can understand it, let alone an adult or an unbeliever who wants to understand it in very lay terms and sentences that are just easy to understand. So in the future, I want to release that too for anyone, even kids who want to learn it.
Well, I'll do you one better. I will write a book called Presup for Babies. So it'll really simplify it. It'll be goo goo gaga. It'll be the first set of pages, and by the impossibility of the contrary, we'll throw that in there somewhere.
And then make an audiobook so the pregnant women can have their kids hear it in the womb and just get going,
That got really weird real quick. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening in. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining me. Until next time, guys, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.